That July, all the laws of nature seemed to have collapsed. After a heavy rain that lasted all night in the capital, the temperature plummeted. The sky became strangely quiet, no longer the chirping of cicadas, no longer the smell of damp soil of summer, but instead the air was thick, cold and heavy to the point of suffocation. After just one night, the whole city seemed to have entered winter, but not a normal winter. It was the beginning of something much more terrible. I was an ordinary person, living an ordinary life. Every morning, I waited for the bus at the old bus stop, where the plastic roof had become opaque due to time and dust. But that morning, as I waited for the bus, the sky above suddenly changed color, a dull gray with a metallic blue tinge, as if the sky was oxidizing and cracking. A vague sense of unease appeared in my heart, the premonition that I often had, like someone born to sense disaster from afar. I checked my phone. The weather forecast was a series of red alerts. Unusually heavy snowfall in the next few days. Temperatures could drop to -15 degrees or even lower. Limit going out. Prepare essentials. I was confused. Snow? July? In this tropical climate, all logic was turned upside down. Just an hour later, when I sat down at my desk, it started to snow outside. The snowflakes were falling white, thicker and faster than any winter I had ever witnessed. In the office, no one laughed anymore. People started whispering, calling home, reading the news online. Very quickly, we discovered, it was not only in the capital, it was snowing all over the world. I asked to leave work early and ran straight to the supermarket. It was instinct. When disaster strikes, people think about food, water, and survival. I gathered everything I could. Instant noodles, dry food, sausages, bottled water, batteries, lamps, candles, lighters, mini water heaters, cold medicine, headache medicine, even masks and scarves. When I pushed the cart to the apartment elevator, the pile of stuff was so heavy that I had to put it down on the floor and wait for it to be moved bit by bit. At that moment, the aunt from the downstairs neighbor, seeing me, walked over and asked, "Why did you buy so much? Is everything gone? Next time, go to the market a little earlier." I forced a smile, thought for a moment. I said I was busy, so I just bought a little more now, then kept quiet to avoid talking anymore because I didn't want to talk to others. Most of the time I wanted to be alone. She didn't answer. She just kept quiet for a moment, then slowly said, "Last night. My cat kept staring out the window and hissing. I thought something was wrong with it. Now I understand." That night, the internet began to flicker. The news was filled with keywords like climate change red, repeat extinction event, global temperature reversal, atmosphere destroyed. Some unofficial sources even spread videos of strange creatures appearing in the snowstorms in many places around the world. No one knew what was really happening. Only one thing was certain. This was no longer a natural phenomenon. I pulled the curtains, locked the windows, and turned off all the lights. Outside, the snow was still falling. There was no sign of stopping. I sat in the living room, wrapped in a blanket, quietly listening to my heartbeat. The next morning, I woke up to an eerie white light. The windows were covered with fog. The whole world was encased in a thick layer of ice like a prism. I tried to open the window, but it was frozen solid. The floor below was deserted. No one was going to the market, no buses, nothing but snow and wind. I turned on the old radio, hoping that there was still a channel that worked. A hoarse voice said, "We repeat, the northern regions have lost all contact. Those who are still alive, seek shelter underground if possible. Avoid going outside. The temperature continues to drop. The phenomenon called the eternal snowstorm has spread to the continents. This is not a normal winter. This is the end of the climate cycle. This could be the beginning of a new era." I turned off the radio. The feeling was no longer fear. It was a kind of numbness, as if all emotions had frozen along with the world. I opened my notebook and began to write the first lines, the first day after the world froze. I am still alive. I don't know how long, but I will write it down, if anyone is still around to read it. And I wrote, line by line, page by page, in the dark, in the -20-degree cold, in a world without sunlight. After returning home, I put all the things I bought in the refrigerator, then checked the warehouse again. There were 2 30-kilogram bags of rice inside. There were also some vegetables and fruits, and even if I didn't go out for a month or two, these were enough for me to eat alone. Hello everyone, remember to subscribe, like, and comment to support our channel. The next day, the temperature had dropped to -18 degrees. I didn't want to get up, but as an office worker, I still had to grit my teeth and persevere. Otherwise, the time would be gone. I was wearing a thick down jacket, waiting for the bus, and suddenly an idea popped into my head. So I turned around and went to the supermarket again. This time I just bought a bunch of mineral water, thinking that in a short time there will be no shortage of water problems. After getting home, my heart did not know what happened and I was very depressed. In order to be relieved, I opened the phone to prepare to find something to make myself happy. I looked around, then I called my parents to ask if our hometown is cold. My parents asked why today am I free to call them. I answered perfunctorily, then asked if the temperature in the hometown has dropped. It has reached -20 degrees, but fortunately there is a heater in the house, very warm after the morning. Don't worry for parents, take care of yourself, my parents replied. Then after hanging up the phone, I looked out the window at the snow. I always felt like things were going to get worse, and that feeling of unease seemed to spread throughout my body. Although the snow outside had been falling non-stop for many days, fortunately the roads had not been completely frozen. The snow was falling steadily and continuously, but not thick enough to make traveling dangerous. People with private cars could still move around, although they had to be much more careful. For me, that was enough to maintain my daily survival route: go to the supermarket, buy food, then stop by the essential stores, and then return home like an ant, diligently carrying each piece of food back to the nest. I didn't buy a lot at once like everyone else, maybe because I was cautious, or maybe because I couldn't handle it. Instead, I divided it up every day. Every day I went to buy a little. Instant noodles, milk, dry bread, packaged sausages, canned fish. Then I started thinking bigger. If the snow didn't stop, the power might go out at any moment. So I bought flashlights, spare batteries, a mini gas stove, and a small solar panel with a built-in charger. Warming items like electric blankets, thermal bags, fleeces, waterproof gloves. I gathered everything on the shelves, leaving nothing behind. I felt like an ant, really, bringing a little bit home every day, accumulating little by little. As the room filled up with boxes of dry goods, bags of canned goods, and equipment, I felt like I was living in a low-level simulation of a survival bunker. It was the 7th day since the snow had started, constantly, relentlessly. It wasn't a steady snowfall, but it wasn't a let-up either. It just kept falling, blanketing the streets, the roofs, and the trees that had been yellowing since early summer. The city was quiet, and everything was moving at a different pace than before, slow, careful, and cautious. The government finally issued an emergency notice. All schools were temporarily closed, non-essential services were forced to stop. People were advised to limit going out as much as possible, only going out when absolutely necessary, and were required to ensure their own safety. A message from my company also arrived shortly after. Starting tomorrow, all employees would officially switch to working from home. Surprisingly, my company responded very quickly. This afternoon, HR sent a notice that they would distribute survival supplies to all employees. Each person would receive a 20-kilogram bag of rice, 10-kilogram flour, and a 5-liter barrel of cooking oil. Those things, in peacetime, perhaps not many people cared about, but now, in the context of supermarkets being destroyed, they were like pure gold. With just those things, I could live for a few more weeks, even a month. But the problem was how to carry them home. Suddenly there was a loud noise right after that. I immediately searched for the source of the sound. It was from the window looking outside, below a car crash. I quickly took out the phone to call Kelvin's phone number. I looked outside. It seems like there was a car accident. Are you okay? Kelvin stood at the scene of the car accident to check the situation. I probably have to call for help, but still try to check the car condition and the state of the main street. It's okay, I'll wait and see how to handle it, Kelvin replied. I looked at the snow leopard outside the window, vaguely worried. Anyway, the weather outside is extremely low. In a while it will really freeze to death. The first time I opened my phone to check the news, what I saw was the empty shelves of large supermarkets. The goods in the supermarket were all sold out. I understood the seriousness of the problem, so I called Kelvin again. You don't have to wait, come to my house now, the subway can run later and then go. A moment later, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and confirmed that it was Kelvin outside. I quickly opened the door. I knew he was frozen. I immediately cooked him a pot of hot sausage noodles so he could eat quickly and hot. It was only instant noodles. My eyes were uneasily looking out the window, not understanding why this beautiful snow scene came like a disaster. While I was still thinking, Kelvin's phone suddenly rang. Kelvin was still uncomfortable and carefully kept his voice down, but the other end of the phone shouted loudly. You brat, you still haven't found a way to come back and send us the goods. Do you want us to freeze to death? It's best if you die out there. After the other party finished scolding, he hung up the phone fiercely. I turned my head away and pretended not to hear anything. Just like that, we waited until 11 o'clock at night. The snow still showed no signs of stopping. If it continued like this, the first floor would probably be flooded. I took out my phone to check the information online. Now the comments on the forum are everywhere. Everyone is panicking. For example, will there be any more natural disasters on the apocalypse? All kinds of rumors. Suddenly I thought of something. It's so cold that the water pipes are likely to freeze. I quickly went to check if the water had stopped. When I turned on the faucet, I saw that the water was still flowing. The water was still flowing. I quickly took out a container that could be used to get water, but then I heard another startling explosion. Water dripping. Slowly I knew that the water pipes were frozen. In July, there was often heavy rain overnight. The world quickly cooled down and the snow fell strangely. The snow outside had flooded the car. There was nowhere to go. I understood that I could only store food and water to survive in this cold. I quickly turned on the faucet and found that there was no water stoppage. The water was still running, so I took out a usable container and the faucet made a choking sound and the water was dripping slowly. Only then did I know it was over. The water pipe was frozen. I quickly went to the kitchen to look at the existing inventory. Mineral water had about a dozen bottles left. I saved some drinks with my colleague Kelvin. Estimated it could last a month, but luckily the heating in the room did not stop. If so, at least it could make the room a little warmer. It was already past 4 a.m. The snow outside was getting heavier. The cold wind blew into my heart. I was cold. The sudden reminder message made my heart beat faster. I knew what it was. Suddenly I saw the group information message rang, full of messages saying, why did the heating system suddenly stop? The team leader replied, the professional labor team quickly go out to solve the problem because the temperature is too low. The heating system has a serious problem. It can only be temporarily stopped. It is currently being rescued. Then the next information is all complaints and requests for help, asking neighbors to help with some blankets, shoes or emergency medicine, and someone in my family caught a cold. I called an ambulance but couldn't get a car. Actually, I knew this was just the beginning of the bad side of human nature that would completely explode later. Then I went to bed in a state of anxiety because the temperature was too low. I could only bury my head in the blanket. At least that could make my own temperature rise a little. The next morning, I woke up very early, feeling the cold that made me huddled under the thick blanket. Even though I was wearing 3 layers of clothes, 2 layers of pants, and a scarf wrapped around my neck, my head still throbbed from the cold air seeping through every small gap. I lifted the curtain and looked outside. The snow was still falling endlessly, each snowflake thick and heavy, falling as if it never intended to stop. I shook my hand as I opened my phone. Luckily, it was still working. The screen showed a weather warning. The current outside temperature was minus 48 degrees Celsius. I stared at it, not believing the number. Minus 48? It was a temperature that could kill a person in just a few minutes standing outside, even if wearing thick clothes. By this time, Kelvin was also awake, his face pale from the cold and lack of sleep. He walked over, his expression serious. We can't go on like this. No matter how many layers of clothes we wear, people will freeze to death at this temperature. We have to find a way to warm up the living space immediately. I nodded slightly, my heart also feeling uneasy. Kelvin pondered for a moment and then said, I think we should make a simple stove. Separate the wooden furniture and burn it. It can last for a while. I looked at him in surprise. You really know how to do it? Kelvin didn't hesitate. Never done it before, but I understand the principle. I used to be a chef at a 5-star restaurant. I know how to safely light a fire in a closed space. I was really surprised. A person who was always quiet, rigid, and never friendly at work had such an interesting past. I nodded slightly, agreeing to trust him. There was no other choice. We got to work. First, we taped up all the cracks in the windows and doors, anywhere that might let cold air in. Next, we took the old aluminum chimney from the kitchen hood and temporarily attached it to the window, securing it securely with cloth, tape, and silicone, to prevent toxic gases like carbon monoxide or coal stove gas from causing asphyxiation. When the homemade stove was complete, Kelvin lit a fire from old pieces of furniture and shelves that had been disassembled. The fire flared up, filling the room with a strong smell of burnt wood, but also with the first warmth we had felt in days. The windows were double glazed, which fortunately held the heat well. As long as they weren't opened, the room would warm up gradually over the course of a few hours. Although living with someone of the opposite sex in a small, informal space had always felt awkward and uncomfortable, it didn't matter now. Survival came first. I checked my phone for the news, but all I saw were reports of death. People freezing to death in their cars, people waiting outside the supermarket after waiting too long to open, people dying while trying to walk a short distance to borrow some firewood from a neighbor. Although the power had not been cut off, the air conditioning had long since stopped heating. It was simply not designed to withstand such extreme cold. I shuddered at the thought of those who had no way to keep warm, had no food, no shelter. They could only wait for death to come slowly, coldly, silently. I sighed, but at least there was one piece of good news. I had received a text message from my parents back home. They lived in the countryside, with a traditional wood stove. My dad told me not to worry, they were fine and there would be a place for me if I could come back. But in this situation, if I could come back, was a far-fetched phrase. Kelvin, on the other hand, had not had a single moment of peace. His face had been tense since morning, his eyebrows furrowed. Until his phone rang. Kelvin looked at the caller ID, then gritted his teeth and pressed the answer button. I heard a frantic shout from the other end of the phone, an old, hoarse man's voice. "Why are you only picking up now? We really can't hold on any longer. Bring some thermals and food back. Otherwise, we'll freeze to death." Kelvin was silent. The person on the other end continued to shout. "Do you want me to go out and freeze to death? You white-eyed wolf. You're still only thinking about yourself. I've raised you for so many years, and now you're not helping me? Even if I die for you, it's worth it, because I've sacrificed my whole life for you." I was stunned when I heard this. That tone wasn't a plea. It was an order, a venting of anger, an unimaginable pressure. Kelvin said nothing, just hung up the phone quietly. But I could clearly see the terrible struggle in his eyes. Then he sat down, silently holding his head. I understood. This was a family matter, and I had no right to interfere. But I could clearly feel that Kelvin was not loved by his family. Perhaps he had been forced, had to bear responsibility, and had to endure heavy pressure from people who kept saying, "I raised you." I said nothing, just put a warm towel on his hand. Kelvin remained silent. Outside, the snow was still falling. The temperature continued to drop. And we, still had to survive. The next morning, as if by an unconscious habit, I woke up and vaguely pulled open the curtains. The snow was still falling, but something was different. I squinted to take a closer look. The snow was smaller, falling sparsely, not as dense as the previous days. The dim light reflected off the white snow outside flooded into the room, giving me a glimmer of hope that the weather might be improving. However, that hope was quickly extinguished when I looked down. The second floor balcony of the building opposite, was completely submerged in snow. The windows that had once been at human height were now only barely visible at the top. I realized something terrifying. We were buried under meters of snow, and getting out was impossible. The walkways, stairs, doors, were all sealed off. The building had officially become a giant freezer. Still, I felt a little lucky. The food and supplies in the house were still enough to last a while. At least, we wouldn't have to risk our lives to get food. I went back to the kitchen room and decided to cook breakfast. Not because I was hungry, but because I knew that cooking could also warm up the living space a little. When the electric stove was on, even a small amount of heat could raise the temperature of the room a little. I took a pack of instant noodles, boiled water, and then put the noodles in. Hello everyone, remember to subscribe, like, and comment to support our Stories for Sleeps channel. The aroma of scallion oil and hot soup spread throughout the room. Strangely, at this time, a normal bowl of noodles also became a luxury, making people feel warm. In the afternoon, I continued to light the fire. Kelvin's homemade wood stove was still working quite well. While the fire burned, the warmth it gave off made me feel comfortable, almost a kind of temporary happiness. I turned to Kelvin, thinking he would feel satisfied too, but his face was the complete opposite. Tense, anxious, his eyes fixed on the pile of wood in the corner. "We only have enough wood left to burn for a month at most," he said in a low voice. "If the weather doesn't warm up, or there's no rescue, I'm afraid." Kelvin didn't finish his sentence. He looked at the fire, then at me, as if he was considering. I didn't need him to elaborate, because I knew. if the fire went out, if the wood ran out, if the temperature continued to drop, we, like everyone else, would freeze to death. I asked, trying to break the heavy atmosphere, aren't you afraid of dying? Kelvin looked at me. It was a strange look, mixed with exhaustion and acceptance. What's the use of being afraid? If fear can't change the situation, why let it take over? I was silent. He was right, though the answer made me even more confused. I began to think about the next days. If the snow didn't melt, if the buildings collapsed, if all the supplies ran out. How would we survive? Just then, there was a knock on the door. Not loud, but urgent and somewhat urgent. I jumped up, ran to the door, and peered through the peephole. It was the man who lived across the hall, whom I had seen briefly a few times. His face was pale from the cold, his eyes red. I opened the door a little, still holding the lock. What's wrong? I asked. The man was urgent. My child is sick. He has a fever, chills, please, do you have medicine? Can you lend us some? I was confused. A series of scenarios immediately appeared in my mind, pretending to ask for medicine to rob, attack, or infect. But he didn't seem to be acting. He bowed his head, almost pleading. Please, we really have no other choice. We've searched the whole house. We can only knock on the neighbor's door. I was in a fierce battle. Should I help someone or protect myself? But then I remembered, the disaster had just begun. People's hearts had not yet been distorted to the point of losing all humanity. Maybe they were really in trouble. I said, wait a minute. I'll check. Then I ran in to get some fever reducers, cold medicine, and some common anti-inflammatory pills. Then I turned around, opened the door a little, pushed the medicine bag through, and quickly slammed the door shut. Standing at the door for just a few seconds, I felt chilled to the bone. It was really impossible to joke around in this minus tens of degrees cold. From the other side of the door, his voice rang out, full of emotion. Thank you very much. If you need anything in the future, other than food, we can support you in any way we can. I replied briefly, no need. Don't come again. Then I went back inside. Kelvin stood there, silently looking at me. I was a bit embarrassed. You don't agree with the way I did it? Kelvin shook his head and said slowly, no. Being too cold at the beginning of a disaster can easily make people hate us. Later, when our food supply runs out, we are easy targets. On the contrary, helping within a safe range, like you just did, is the wise thing to do. I let out a soft breath. He continued, actually, if you weren't here, I probably wouldn't have dared to give you the medicine. But since you're here, I believe you can handle it. You did the right thing. I lowered my head, not knowing what my feelings were. Maybe it was a relief, maybe it was a little reassuring. We sat down, in a room that was gradually warming up thanks to the fire. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Although it was lighter than yesterday, it didn't matter. The thickness outside had already exceeded the second floor, and the temperature was still deadly. I understood. We couldn't hope for a miracle. We had to continue preparing. We had to continue living. Even if it was just for one more day. Time passed quietly and alone. It had been more than 10 days since the first snowfall blanketed the city. Every morning when I woke up, I tried to imagine the sunlight or the chirping of birds, but those things seemed to have disappeared from this world. Instead, there was an eerie silence, and the wind, the howling of wandering souls with no place to return. The temperature outside had now reached minus 60 degrees Celsius, an unimaginable number. At that level, just stepping outside for a few seconds would freeze you on the spot. I had read in books that boiling water could instantly turn into dry ice at such low temperatures. Now, I had witnessed it with my own eyes. This world, in the middle of July, summer, had turned into a white and deadly nightmare. The strange cold had begun after just one night of heavy rain. From rain to ice, then ice to snow, and the snow never stopped. In less than 48 hours, the city was buried under more than 2 stories of snow. All transportation stopped, communications were nearly cut off, and the electricity had been cut off for days. Now, the only source of life was what people could burn to stay warm and survive. Fortunately, the temperature did not continue to drop. Kelvin said that if it had been 5 degrees colder, our small stove would definitely not have lasted. At that time, the human body probably could not have endured much longer. To keep warm, I slept in a small tent in the living room at night, because the smaller the space, the easier it was to maintain the temperature. We covered the tent with a blanket, put a rug underneath, and lit a small wood stove in the corner of the room. I had just closed my eyes, preparing to fall into a fragile sleep, when I suddenly heard the sound of metal colliding in the hallway. The sound was very small, but in this spine-chillingly quiet space, it was terrifyingly clear. I whispered to Kelvin, "Did you hear anything?" Kelvin did not answer, just squeezed his hand lightly and stood up, slowly walking towards the door. But it was too late. Two strange figures were already waiting outside, holding crude but sharp weapons. One was a middle-aged man with a thick beard and glaring eyes, the other was younger, with a cold face. Kelvin stood right in front of the door, his voice low, "What do you want? Do you know that trespassing is illegal?" The older man sneered, "Are you still talking about the law? Having a bite to eat is good enough. Quickly take out all your stuff." Kelvin turned his head to look at me, his eyes filled with pain and helplessness. I understood, I was behind him. If they wanted to break in, I would be the first to be attacked. I clenched the small knife in my hand, slowly walking behind Kelvin, preparing for the worst-case scenario. Today might be a special day to die. The leader snapped, "Don't dawdle. Get to work." I knew villains often died from talking too much, so in situations like this, action always came unexpectedly. Just as I thought, the leader threw a sharp wooden stick straight at Kelvin. The throw was so powerful and accurate that Kelvin fell on the spot, his head hitting the wall. Immediately, I reacted instinctively. I raised my bow, aimed at the attacker. But before I could release the arrow, the other one jumped from behind, pinning me to the ground. The arrow flew out of his hand, rolling into the corner of the room. "Where's the food?" he growled, his hand around my neck. "If you don't give it to me, you'll die right there." I couldn't move, my breath hitched, tears flowed uncontrollably, from fear, from pain, from helplessness. I thought I was going to die. But at that moment Kelvin jumped up like a wounded animal, used all his strength to rush at the one pressing me down, punched him hard in the head, causing the other to fall backwards onto the floor and pass out. Hello everyone, remember to subscribe, like, and comment to support our Stories for Sleeps channel. I lay there, gasping, my mind blank. Kelvin gasped, cold sweat pouring out even though the room was still very cold. But I knew, we had just won a deadly battle. Kelvin then dragged the two intruders out of the house, not killing them, but not letting them return. He dragged them back to their own apartment, the one down the hall where we'd seen the lights flickering the night before. I entered, no longer hesitating. Before me was a metal pot burning, the logs burning unevenly, the fire small, the smoke thick. The walls were blackened with smoke, the ceiling moldy with moisture and soot. I opened their refrigerator, it was empty. Nothing, no food, no medicine, no tools. The room was cold, dirty, and hopeless. Kelvin quietly closed the door. Back in our apartment, we blocked the entrance to the top of the stairs with cabinets, boards, and old furniture. This floor was safe for now, at least no one could climb it without making a sound. Kelvin used some wire to secure it, checking every detail. I was no longer quivering from the cold, but from the feeling of having escaped death by a hair's breadth. For the first time, I realized that life in this world is not measured in months or years, but in hours and minutes. Every day that remains alive is a battle. Every warmth that remains is a victory. And every right decision can save lives. I turned back to look at Kelvin, who was quietly sitting and relighting the small wood stove. The fire flickered, illuminating his face, revealing the scratches and dried blood on his collar. But his eyes were still calm, full of determination. No one said anything, because there was no need. The silence at this moment was the consensus to continue surviving. Today was the 33rd day since the disaster began. I sat leaning against the wall, looking at the faint light coming in from the snow-covered window, finally understanding why they came to rob us that day. Not because of greed, but for survival. In a world where every bite of food was life, morality was gradually eroded by hunger and cold. At that time, I blamed them and was angry. But now, when my food was almost gone, I understood that feeling. The feeling of knowing death was approaching step by step, but still having to try to prolong life every day. Today, there was only one bottle of water left in the house. Outside, although the snow had begun to fall, the temperature had not warmed up. Everything was still frozen, even my soul seemed to be starting to cool down. I poured the last bottle of water into the pot, boiled it, hoping to at least make one last bowl of instant noodles. The heat rose, thin and fragile, almost disappearing in the freezing air of the cold room. That afternoon, I sat in front of the small stove, staring at the flickering flames, knowing that from this moment on, we would have nothing to eat. Kelvin also sat there, as silent as me. After a long while, he spoke. I have food in the car. It's what the company gave out on the first day. If we can get that, it will be enough for us to live for at least a few more weeks. I immediately shook my head, almost jumping up. No way. The snow outside hasn't completely melted. The temperature is still below -50. If you go out, you'll definitely freeze. You can't take such a risk. Even if we starve to death, we'll die together. Kelvin didn't say anything more, but I could clearly see determination in his eyes. And I knew that once Kelvin made up his mind, he would do it. The moment Kelvin opened the door, I ran over and grabbed his hand, squeezing it tightly. Promise me. You must come back. Kelvin looked at me, nodded slightly. Don't worry. I'll do everything I can to come back. I stood at the window, watching Kelvin's every step, my heart feeling like it was being squeezed every second. He was only about 300 meters away from the car. The car that the company sent the goods to was right at the beginning of the street, in front of the gate of our area. That was why Kelvin wanted to go, because it was very close, but also extremely dangerous. I saw him sinking deeper into the thick snow with each step, barely able to lift his feet. The cold wind whipped at him, his hair flying wildly, his thick coat covered in ice. But Kelvin still tried, step by step, gritting his teeth to cross the line between life and death. Finally, he reached the car. I saw him open the door, hurriedly stuff the food and water packages into his backpack, then hug 2 boxes of supplies and try to turn back. But when I was only a few dozen meters away from the hallway, my heart suddenly ached with a strong sense of unease. I didn't have time to think much. Grabbing my weapon, I rushed down the stairs. In the dark hallway, I saw a strange man carrying a suitcase standing next to Kelvin, who had collapsed against the wall. He lay motionless, blood staining the snow. Kelvin, I shouted. The man turned around, intending to pull something out of his jacket. I didn't think so, I just swung the fire extinguisher in my hand and threw it straight at him. There was a loud sound, the fire extinguisher hit him and he fell to the floor. I knelt down next to Kelvin, grabbed his cold hand, and asked tremblingly, What's wrong? Can you still move? Kelvin didn't answer. His eyes were wide open, but there was no light. The hand loosened. He was dead. He was dead. To protect the supply, so I could live. As of today, it has been exactly 3 months since the disaster began. I survived thanks to the supplies that Kelvin had brought back with his life. Each packet of noodles, each bottle of water, each pill, all were his remains. I had no more tears to cry. All that was left was the will to live, even if it was only for him. As I sat in the corner, the sound of a helicopter came from outside the window. I jumped up and ran to the window. This is the rescue team. We are looking for survivors. Don't give up hope. Signal if you can hear us. I couldn't believe my ears. Rescue. Finally. Here. I shouted, waved my hands, and banged on the window. But at that moment, a sudden snowstorm arose, more fierce than anything I had ever seen. The wind howled, the snow flew into the sky, and the temperature dropped instantly. I saw the helicopter swerve in the air. The helicopter lost control and crashed straight into a nearby building. The explosion shook the sky, smoke billowed. And then, the ground shook. The entire building I was in began to shake violently, as if it had been lifted and dropped. I heard a loud crack from the wall next to me, spiderweb-like cracks spreading across the walls. The ceiling began to fall in large chunks. I knew. The structure of the building had been damaged by the helicopter crash. The tilt of the entire apartment seemed to be dragging me to the right. I couldn't stay. If I stayed, die from the collapse. If I went outside, die from the cold. There was no real option for survival. But then, the window glass exploded. A strong blast of snow came in, blowing everything away, hitting me in the face, knocking me backwards. The cold wind blew, paralyzing my whole body. I panicked and crawled back into the corner. But bricks fell, dust flew into my face, and then a large piece of debris fell from the ceiling, hitting me in the head. Everything went blurry. I felt dizzy, my heart pounding. Just before I blacked out, I saw something appear outside the window. A ladder. That ladder dropped down from somewhere, in the middle of a snowstorm, in the middle of a ruin. And then, darkness fell. When I opened my eyes, I found myself in an unfamiliar room. Pale fluorescent light reflected off the old metal ceiling. A smell of antiseptic and cold air hit my face, making me shiver. I was lying on a hospital bed, my hands wrapped in bandages, my head still dizzy. Next to me was a female medical worker in a white coat. Seeing me awake, she immediately leaned over and said, "You're finally awake. When you were unconscious, another rescue helicopter arrived. If it had been a few minutes later, maybe." I didn't hear the rest of the sentence, just nodded slightly. My throat was dry, and I didn't know how long I had been unconscious. In that dreamy moment, I thought I was dead, or at least no longer existed in this world. The nurse continued speaking, as if to reassure me. "You are currently in an emergency shelter, 500 meters underground. This used to be a bomb shelter from the last century, restored and modernized to deal with future emergencies. But everything here is strictly controlled. Medicine, food, water, all need to go through multiple layers of approval before reaching us." I fell silent. The more I listened, the more I realized that this place was not the paradise I had hoped for. It was a miniature society, and in this miniature society, everything had a price. That evening, I was moved to a room on a floor closer to the ground. That made me happy, not because of the convenience, but because I could look up and see the snow falling outside the small window. The white scene outside, though terrifying, made me feel connected to the world above. I sat there, my eyes glued to the thick layer of ice covering the frosted glass, my mind wandering to Kelvin, to the bloody hallway, to the rescue ladder, and then the doorbell rang, pulling me back to reality. I opened the door. Another paramedic stood in front of me, holding a tray of food. She gave me a slight nod and turned away, saying nothing more. I looked at the tray of food, frowning slightly. A bowl of watery noodles, unclear what kind of noodles, tasteless. There was also a small, round metal box, looking like canned food but without a label. A voice spoke behind me. The woman on the same floor, thin and with deep eyes. "You are a patient, it is already good that you can eat like this. We in the civilian area are only given thin porridge and some canned vegetables. You still have some meat." I looked at the tray again. There were indeed some small pieces of meat, about the size of chopsticks. Only then did I realize that I was on a high floor, and might have been placed in a priority group, while the others were not. "I am not used to eating this. You can take it." I pushed the tray towards the woman. She smiled faintly and shook her head. "You'd better put it away. If you eat a little less than usual here, you won't be hungry later. Sometimes when you want to eat, there won't be anything left." I asked her, "Why don't you send someone to the surface to find more supplies?" The woman sighed, looking out the ventilation shaft as if she didn't want to be overheard. "People go every day, but the climate is harsh, going out is dangerous, and very few people return alive. Every trip costs their lives. And the distribution of resources is unfair." She whispered, as if afraid someone would hear. "Food is scarce, but the people on the upper floors get more. The people on the lower floors get hungrier every day. I once saw a child being beaten for secretly taking a piece of cake." My heart sank. I stepped out of the room, wanting to breathe some air, even if it was just the recycled air from the filtration system. But what I saw in the hallway made me freeze. The underground shelter, which was supposed to be a place of salvation, turned out to be a world of stratification and chaos. Ahead, a young man ran from the supply area, holding something in his shirt. Behind him were two people in uniform, clearly the internal control force. The man shouted, his eyes filled with anger. "Every time, it is us who have to go above ground to find food, to endure the cold, to risk our lives. And you guys just sit here giving orders, dividing up the portions. Why do people like us have to eat the least when distributing food? Is my life not worth anything?" One of the two law enforcers said coldly. "If you are not convinced, get out of here. The law is the law. If you say more, we will remove your name from the distribution list. You guys are just eating off the heads of others. If you don't distribute it fairly, it will eventually collapse." The hallway was silent. No one spoke. A few doors closed, silently. I stood there, my heart pounding, sweat pouring out through my thin hospital gown. I had thought I was saved. But in fact, I had just fallen into another cage. Hearing the angry words of the man stopped by the control force, I felt a choking feeling rise in my heart. A clear thought appeared in my mind. I wanted to leave this place. If above ground was freezing to death, then underground was dying slowly from despair. Above ground, cold, harsh. Underground, stifling, dark. Neither place had any hope. But at least if I died above ground, I could choose my own way of ending it, a cool, free, uncontrolled death. Worth it than being buried underground in torment, jostling, hunger, and panic. I turned away from the chaotic hallway and walked quickly to my room, the only place where I could lock myself. I sat down on the bed and thought silently. I understood why they were fighting, why there was a riot. No one volunteered to risk going above ground to find goods, but the shelter still needed supplies. So they forced each other to take turns. That rotation system, which seemed fair, was actually coercion in disguise. The weak, the voiceless, always had to go first. The problem was temporarily under control for a few days, then a new alarm sounded. A group of people ran away again, crowding at the main gate demanding fairness, demanding reasonable explanations. But nothing was reasonable in this post-apocalyptic world. The management office used a loudspeaker to plead with the crowd to calm down, promising an explanation. Hello everyone, remember to subscribe, like, and comment to support our Stories for Sleeps channel. But no one believed it anymore. Explanations? We're tired of hearing them. Don't try to fool us. If you want justice, we'll go in and get it ourselves. The crowd roared in agreement. At that moment, I leaned against the wall and watched silently. I understood that any solution would lead to a deeper crisis. If I gave in and gave more food to the rioters, the rest would think I was being biased, and the riot would start again. But if I used violence to suppress them, they would fight back fiercely, and once it got out of control, this shelter would turn into hell. I had to leave, the sooner the better. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. I turned on the small flashlight, took out the old backpack I had brought from the old apartment building, and dumped all the remaining snacks on the floor. It wasn't much, but it was enough to last me 5 to 7 days, if I ate sparingly. I sat there staring at the food in the dim light, then lay down on the bed, closed my eyes, and my head was still spinning with thousands of chaotic thoughts. Can we survive outside? How cold is it? Is the snow still thick? Is there anyone else hiding out there? I finally fell asleep, exhausted. The next morning, I woke up with a headache but more determined than ever. I walked to the small window in the hallway and looked out. Snow was still falling, cold. The wind cut like a knife into my skin. But that didn't stop my determination. I put on a coat, a scarf, and gloves, and walked out of the room with the intention of going to the management office, where I could register to go out. I wasn't sure if they would agree, but I needed to know how the system worked. I hadn't gone far when I heard hurried footsteps behind me. At the same time, a scream tore through the hallway. Murder! Murder! My heart almost stopped. I immediately turned and ran back to my room. My legs were shaking, but I still tried to run fast. In the distance, the control force was deploying weapons, lining up in a row across the hallway. The protesters began to attack. The sound of metal clashing, people screaming echoed throughout the small space, the sound bouncing off the concrete walls making everything even more terrifying. I entered the room, slammed the door shut, leaned against it, gasping for breath, my hands shaking. I knew I had just escaped death by a hair's breadth. But before I could recover, there was a knock on the door. I held my breath. I didn't dare answer. I didn't dare move. I didn't know who was outside, an acquaintance, a medic, or a rebel. Knock, knock, knock. This time, the knock was louder, more decisive. I approached the door, gently pressing my ear against it. A small voice came from outside. It's me, the one who treated you. Are you in there? I hesitated. What's the matter? I know you want to escape from here. Me too. There was a short silence. I have a map of the subfloor escape route. If you want to leave here, get ready. But why? Did this person appear at this time? Before I could react, the alarm sounded again in the hallway. Red lights flashed. The loudspeaker system blared. All residents on floors B2 and B3, return to your rooms immediately. The disturbance has gotten out of control. Special forces will take action. Anyone who does not comply will be treated as a rebel. I stood still in the darkness, clutching my backpack tightly in my arms. Tonight, I would have to make the biggest decision of my life. Stay and wait for death, or gamble your life to find freedom. And I think I have the answer. July often has heavy rain overnight. The world quickly cools down and snow falls strangely. The rescue helicopter loses control, and the blizzard directly collapses the building where I live. But fortunately I was taken to another place by a helicopter. The place I was taken to is the refugee concentration camp in the underground fortress, but when I arrived, I quickly arranged everything, intending to immediately flee from this hellish place. Because outside the management is indiscriminately attacking refugees. I looked out the window, the blizzard did not decrease. I understood that even if I died outside, I could not stay here. When I thought about how to survive after getting out of here, there was a heavy knock on the door again. Instinctively, I was about to open the door. But just as my hand touched the handle, a terrifying thought suddenly flashed through my mind. What if this is a trap? What if the nurse wasn't a helper, but a law enforcement officer? What if they were here to take me away and trade me, like the vague rumors I'd heard in the dark hallway? The knocking came again, this time more urgently. Open the door. If you don't run now, you'll never get another chance. It sounded like she was worried about me, but it was precisely this unusual urgency that made me trust my instincts even more. I took a step back, my eyes glancing around the room for something to defend myself with. The fire extinguisher on the table caught my attention. I quickly grabbed it and smashed it with all my strength against the window glass. Crack. A crack appeared, and then the glass shattered, snow and cold wind rushed in and swirled around me. I shivered, but did not stop. I turned the storage cabinet upside down, crammed myself inside, and closed the door, leaving only a thin gap for air to circulate. In the darkness, I kept my breathing light, my chest tightening with fear. At that moment, the door was kicked open with a loud bang. The sound was dry and angry. That girl can't be allowed to escape. The boss told me to deliver the goods tonight. The voice was deep, hoarse, and commanding, clearly a man. So it was true. I almost stepped out of the room and walked into a trap. Big brother, if the boss wants a living person to trade, then shouldn't I save her? Shut up. You didn't ask when I gave you a job. I recognized the voice of the nurse who had brought me food. Now it was clear that no one here was good. It was all a staged scenario to create a false sense of security. I even shuddered when I thought about the meals she brought me. Was there something mixed in? I pulled out my phone, hoping for a signal, but no. It was still the same barred gray signal, the screen only showing the "no signal" icon. I was desperate. This wasn't an official shelter like they said. This was a black market, a place where living people were bought and sold like commodities. Meanwhile, I heard footsteps heading back outside. He must have run away. That's all there is to the room. What else can I look for? If you can't catch him, you can go in tonight. The man's voice was heavy, followed by a slam of the door. There was a long, deadly silence. I still didn't dare breathe heavily. In the closet, I felt like my heart was about to explode. Then suddenly, there was a shadow right in front of the closet door. The door started to move open. I bit my lip until it bled. My whole body trembled. I was definitely dead, but at that moment an alarm sounded shrill throughout the hallway. The red lights flashed continuously, accompanied by an urgent voice, "Emergency warning. There is an armed conflict on the B2 floor. All personnel without urgent duties return to their positions immediately. Stay away from the danger zone." The person outside the closet paused for a second, then left in a hurry. I collapsed in silence, tears welling up because the feeling of survival was so fragile. I opened the closet very quietly, carefully slipping out. There was only one thought in my head. I had to run. Now, I didn't know exactly where the exit was, but staying here would definitely mean death. I ran down the deserted corridor, weaving through the dark passages, not daring to look at anyone for too long, not making any loud noises. But then a voice came from behind. "What are you doing here?" I was startled, turned around. It was a man in a law enforcement uniform. He looked at me suspiciously. I bowed my head low, and whispered, "Sorry. I went the wrong way." He stared at me for a few seconds, making me want to suffocate. Then he frowned. "Useless brat thing. The collection team is about to leave, follow quickly." I nodded repeatedly, not saying another word. He pushed me towards a group of people standing at the end of the corridor. Most of them looked thin, tired, and their faces dull. I stood among them, not knowing if this was a team sent to the surface to collect goods or a group of prisoners being sold. I didn't know, but I knew that if I wanted to survive, I couldn't stay here any longer. "There's nothing here. Where are we going to gather supplies?" One person in front grumbled, his voice mixed with the whistling wind outside the ventilation duct. "It's so cold, opening your mouth will freeze your brain," another person added. I curled up, silently gripping the strap of my backpack. There was some food, a heater, a small knife, and a few other essentials. I understood one thing. Each of them was life. But then I felt someone staring at me. "Is there anything in your bag?" a dry male voice rang out behind me. I turned around. He was tall, his eyes were sharp. Everyone looked at me. I swallowed. My heart was pounding. I felt as if the whole world was pointing its spear at me. I shouldn't have brought a backpack, shouldn't have carried such a huge thing on my back. It was the clearest sign of someone who had something to lose. I immediately spoke up, my voice trembling slightly. It's just some feminine stuff. It's nothing. Women, always trouble, another man snapped. You're freezing to death and you're still worrying about such nonsense. Just as the atmosphere was starting to get tense, a gunshot rang out from the front, startling everyone. What protest? Shut up and get to work, the commander of the law enforcement team shouted, his gun still smoking. The gunshots silenced everyone, but their eyes were still like knives aimed at me. I knew I had to leave immediately. I held my stomach, trying to look as painful as possible. It hurts. My stomach hurts so much. I have to go find a place to relieve myself. You guys go ahead? A man frowned at me, his voice mocking. She must have eaten too much. Leave her alone, she'll die wherever she wants. The group walked further away, no one looked back at me again. Only a young woman walked by, she whispered, don't be afraid, but her eyes never left the backpack on my back. That look wasn't worried about me. It was greed, jealousy, calculation. I understood immediately, she knew I was lying. Hello everyone, remember to subscribe, like, and comment to support our Stories for Sleeps channel. She wanted my backpack too. But instead of openly snatching it, she played a trick. You help me, I smiled, though my hands were sweaty. I'm a little tired. Can you help me rummage through my bag for some medicine? I led her around a snowbank, out of sight, where no one would notice. She nodded, half shy, half excited. I took off my backpack and handed it to her. Please open the small compartment below for me. There's a box of medicine in there. She quickly took it, bent down to feel inside. At that very moment, I reached into the back of my backpack and pulled out a pair of small folding scissors, carefully hidden since leaving the room. I couldn't hesitate. Swoosh. I swung my hand, the tip of the scissors grazed the woman's side. She screamed, her hands dropped her backpack, and her whole body fell onto the snow, her eyes wide, in disbelief. I snatched the backpack back, my legs shaking, but I gritted my teeth and rushed forward, dodging between the snowbanks, the broken concrete banks, and the winding paths. I knew, if I wasn't ruthless, I would die. Here, pity was a luxury. I have no regrets. I ran like a madman, avoiding all eyes, dodging through the side passages of the basement. No one recognized me, for now, I was as dirty, and disheveled as a new refugee. I stopped behind a big tree, leaning against it, gasping for breath. The smell of blood still lingered on my hands. The scissors in my hand were stained with blood, but I didn't let go. I never thought I could do it. I didn't know how far I'd gone. Every step felt like stepping on sharp needles. My eyes kept blurring, tears mixed with the cold wind, both stinging and painful. I couldn't feel my fingertips, and even my thoughts began to wander. All I knew was that I had to keep going, because if I stopped, I would die. But then, as my body almost collapsed, a blurry figure appeared ahead, an old wooden house, precariously perched in the middle of a sea of white snow. I didn't think any further. I ran forward, my hands shaking, and opened the door. The door was unlocked, the hinges creaking like the moans of a long-forgotten soul. I stepped in. It was dark inside, covered in dust, but the cold wind outside had been blocked. I breathed a sigh of relief and fell to the floor. The wooden house had an old fireplace, a table, a few rotten chairs, and a straw mattress. On the wooden shelf were some old newspapers and some dry wood. I quickly lit a fire, threw the wood into the stove, and in just a few minutes, the fire was glowing red, clearly reflecting my face in the broken mirror hanging on the wall. I was thinner, my skin was pale, my eyes were sunken. I almost didn't recognize myself anymore. Outside the window, the blizzard was still raging madly. I didn't know how long it would last. I didn't know if I could survive. At times, I thought that the whole world had died, and I was the only one left wandering in a white dream. The next day, I stood at the window, holding a slice of rock-hard bread. I had to heat it over the fire to eat it. But even so, tears still fell down my cheeks unconsciously. Not from the cold, but from despair. When will this life end? I asked myself. I have lived here for almost a month. Every day I searched the surrounding area, but apart from this wooden house, there was nothing. No people, no animals, no trace of life. The world seemed to have fallen silent forever. The food in my hands was also just one last meal. I had to collect melted snow, boil it, and drink it. Every night before bed, I ask myself, will I wake up tomorrow? Will I be buried in the blizzard, or will I simply die quietly? That afternoon, when I was almost out of strength, I sat down on the floor, holding my head in my hands, eyes closed. Suddenly, beep, 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 a horn sounded from outside. I opened my eyes. I couldn't believe my ears. The horn continued, sounding clearer, as if it were right in front of the house. I didn't dare to stand up, didn't dare to hope. Because every time I hoped, I was betrayed. The noise stopped. Then a voice rang out. Is anyone home? We are the government rescue team. We are currently conducting a large-scale search and rescue. If you're still alive, please signal immediately. I still didn't move. I didn't know if this was real. Was it an imposter, luring me out and robbing me? Or was it just my last hallucination before I died? I quietly leaned back, resting my head on the straw mattress. For a moment, my consciousness became hazy. The voice rang out again, closer. We are scanning the entire area with a heat detector. We have detected life signals in this house. If you hear it, please speak up. I tried to scream, but my mouth was dry, only a hissing sound came out. My eyes gradually blurred, my mind reeled. My body no longer had enough strength to move. Before I completely lost consciousness, I only had time to think, is this time really saved? I didn't know how long I had been unconscious. But when I woke up, I found myself lying on a hospital bed. Next to me was a soft white light, with a faint smell of antiseptic. Hello everyone, remember to subscribe, like, and comment to support our Stories for Sleeps channel. A medical staff member wearing a protective suit saw me open my eyes, and smiled lightly. Welcome back. You were very strong. We found you unconscious on the wooden floor, about 30 kilometers away from here. The helicopter just took you back. I was speechless. My throat was dry. Tears naturally rolled down my cheeks. I survived. I really did. But I also understood that the war was not over. The world outside was still in chaos. What remained after the disaster was a broken society, where trust was buried under the snow, where people had to be ruthless to survive. I had lost so much. But I was alive, and as long as I was alive, I would not stop. I sat up slowly and looked around. The room was white, sterile and clean. It was like a makeshift medical station, but solidly built. On the wall was the government logo, but no country name, an unfamiliar circle with 3 diagonal lines. The medical staff was still standing there, smiling, a smile that I couldn't read as friendly or mechanical. He said softly, you need to rest for a few more days, your body is severely hypothermic and malnourished. But you will recover. I didn't answer, just nodded. Questions raced through my head. Where am I? Is Kelvin really dead? What did all this mean? And what was this disaster? A few days later, I was taken out of the medical room and into the reintegration area. It was a secret area in the heart of an underground base so deep that the sun never shined. There was a gym, an education area, a library, but everyone looked lifeless. Like fish in an aquarium, well fed but having forgotten how big the ocean used to be. I was given a smart bracelet that recorded all my vital signs, location, and activity times. Everyone here had it. No one was allowed to take it off. For your protection, they said. I didn't believe it. I started digging. Through a few conversations with other survivors, I learned a few things. The global ice disaster happened suddenly, initially as a climate anomaly, but within a few weeks, it turned the Earth into an ice prison. Some governments had anticipated this, building shelters like the one I was in. But most of the population was not informed. Only a small, select group was allowed in. And strangest of all, no one knew what the root cause was. Some said it was a solar impact, some said a failed climate weapon test, and others believed in conspiracy theories that humanity had brought about its own demise. One night, I snuck into the technical area, which was reserved for high-level technical staff only. I wanted to dig deeper. I knew it was dangerous, but I needed to know the truth. I opened a terminal. The password was easier than I thought. I had access to a secret file. Project Zero. Initiate a climate change chain to restructure the world. Launch date, July 14, 2075. Objective: resettlement of humanity, eliminating 60% of the population to balance resources. Managing agency, Global Reconstruction Alliance. Status: Deployed. Irreversible. I felt a chill down my spine, not because of the climate, but because the world I lived in turned out to be just a big stage, and we, the ordinary people, were just puppets. Kelvin was dead. As for the others, they may never have had a chance to survive. I stepped back from the screen, unaware that a security camera had recorded everything. The next day, a man in a black coat called me into a private room. He didn't introduce himself, just flipped through my file and said, "I know what you saw. But that's not important anymore. What's important is, do you want to continue living?" I looked him straight in the eye. "What do you mean?" He replied, "There are two paths. One is to erase your memory, put you in the civilian resettlement program, and live in a delusion. The other is, you cooperate with us. Work in the reception team. Observe, choose who lives and who doesn't." I felt sick. I shook my head. "You think I would sell my soul to live?" He just smirked. "No one chooses. They just adapt." I walked out of the room, my heart empty. I thought about Kelvin, about the people who died on the streets, about the people who were dying in other shelters that no one knew about. I couldn't go back to being a normal person, but I couldn't stand still either. If I had seen the curtain behind this world, then I had to do something. That night, I began to write everything down on a secret storage device, what I knew, what I heard. If I couldn't overthrow them, I would let the truth survive. Because, even though the apocalypse had come, hope was not lost, and the truth was the last thing humanity should forget. I closed the file, carefully hiding the small hard drive in the lining of my backpack. Outside, the early morning food distribution was about to begin. I pulled up my jacket and walked out of the room with a calm face like everyone else. In the long hallway, the fluorescent lights were still blinking. The smell of disinfectant, the smell of artificial food, the smell of survivors, all mixed together to create a suffocating mixture. I passed by the reintegration room, where the newly rescued were learning to forget the past. Some laughed, some cried, some no longer reacted. I wondered, am I really a survivor? Or just a walking corpse? A little girl ran by, holding a broken cookie in her hand, smiling brightly. I stopped and watched her. For a moment, I remembered myself, the first day of my rescue, still vaguely believing that tomorrow could be better. I turned my head and looked at the surveillance camera in the corner of the ceiling. The red light flickered once. I smiled slightly, a smile that no one could tell whether it was despair or defiance. Maybe tomorrow I will be discovered. Maybe I would be arrested, or retrained. But maybe, I would find people like me. People who remembered what the world used to be. People who refused to accept being determined. People who knew that the end of the world was just the beginning. Because one day, we would return to the ground. Not to survive, but to regain our freedom. I stepped into the elevator. The doors closed behind me. Above the control panel were the words, "Ground, Special Access Level." I stared at the button below that panel. And I raised my hand. Thanks for listening to the whole story. Goodbye and see you in the next episodes. Good night.